Just ahead, we head to the House floor for a debate over Speaker Madigan's proposed FY 2017 budget. The budget, known as SB 2048, spends about $40 billion with a projected deficit of $7 billion. This runs about 45 minutes.
On page 8 of the calendar, we have Senate Bill 2048. Leader Curry, Mr. Clerk, please read the bill.
Senate Bill 2048, a bill for next swing appropriations, third reading the Senate bill.
Leader Curry.
Thank you very much, Speaker and members of the House. This bill would contain appropriations for the coming fiscal year, fiscal 17. Much of the appropriation level is set by what we did last year, the budget that was approved by the Assembly for fiscal 16. And other funds appropriations are based primarily on what the governor's proposed spending would have been for fiscal 17. It's important for you to note that this measure does not include those items that have been the subject of court-ordered consent decrees. Those payments are continuing, and we have heard from many providers that they are concerned about the future of those payments given the fiscal problems that face the state. I'd like to say a few words for the record about the way the education, elementary, and secondary budget is funded. There's a single appropriation of nearly $5.5 billion for elementary and secondary schools. This money is being made basically in lieu of the traditional general state aid formula, but nothing in the bill either ends or changes in the long run that current formula. But it does recognize that there are very serious inequities across the state from one school district to another, and in our education task force, as well as in all of our education committees, every observer recognizes and rues the fact that Illinois formula funding is so inequitable for children in low-income areas and for children who themselves are poor. The way the new appropriation will operate is described in the bill. First, the current general state aid payments that schools are getting in this fiscal year would be frozen, and that would include any portion they're getting of the $85 million that we added the stop-loss payments as part of the current year's budget. There's additional money, some $700 million, for an equity grant. Every school district would be eligible to apply for an equity grant, but the bulk of those monies would be directed most heavily to the students who are in those areas where there are high concentrations of poverty. Third, any district that under those two pieces of the program would lose resources compared to what they would expect in the coming fiscal year would be made whole. So according to the figures that ISBE has given us, this appropriation would be adequate to cover the three categories. If there's additional money left, that would be distributed through the current general state aid formula. Again, this appropriation is for all school districts, all the entities that currently get general state aid today. No school would lose any general state aid compared to what they're getting this year. No school would lose any general state aid compared to what their claims could be for the fiscal 17 school year, and many, many, many school districts will receive significantly more money under this proposal than they do today. So why are we offering this proposal today, this full funding budget for fiscal 17? We're offering it because today is May 25th, Speaker and members of this House, May 25th, 2016, and we still don't have a budget for the current fiscal year, which comes to a close June 30th. I am worried for the people of the state of Illinois if we leave this assembly at the end of May without a budget that is adequate to the needs of our low-income seniors, our fragile children, our vulnerable populations. I am appalled at the prospect that we would leave this legislature, this spring session, without providing stable funding for the operations of state government, let alone providing for the resources for those who do not have resources themselves that make them able to thrive and survive in this state. There are many important programs of state government that have been funded through the court system, through consent decrees, but many others have not, and you all know what they are. They're programs to provide tuition help for low-income college kids, money to keep the state universities running, money to see to it that families suffering from problems of autism and epilepsy get some help. It was not until late in the fiscal year that we were able to fund domestic violence shelters, and we only recently have sent to the governor a bill that will provide funding for those people who are victims of rape. It is unconscionable that this state has failed to do its job during the current fiscal year, and it would be even more unconscionable for us to leave this assembly without taking care of our responsibilities for the fiscal year to come. I am, of course, always hopeful that there still is time for us to work cooperatively. I myself have been a member of several of the governor's working groups, and I am hopeful that we might be able to come to compromise and find a way that we can all agree on funding levels and programs for fiscal 17, which begins July 1st. But I don't think we can afford to count on compromise. It didn't work in the current fiscal year, and there's no guarantee that it will in the next. And for us to turn our backs on our responsibilities and fail to leave an insurance policy in place in the event that there is no further compromise would, I think, be a significant disservice to the people of the state of Illinois, particularly to those who are vulnerable, who are fragile, who have no place but to us to turn. With that, Speaker and members of the House, I'm happy to answer your questions. I would appreciate your questions, and I certainly would appreciate your yes vote for passage of Senate Bill 2048.
Chair recognizes Leader Durkin.
Oh, for crying out loud, this is absolutely the biggest joke that I've witnessed in my 18 years in Springfield. Inquiry of the clerk. When was the rules report posted regarding this bill?
Mr. Clerk. Is the question, when was the rules report submitted?
Posted.
Read?
On this bill. On the amendment.
The Rules Committee met this afternoon, and the report was read into the record at 4:57 p.m.
And it is 6:47, excuse me. Okay. Representative Curry, here's a basic question, and I'm sure you have a very thoughtful and witty answer. Witty. Could you tell me what appropriation committee this bill was assigned to that vetted this 500-page bill?
Representative, the appropriations committees have met this year and last year. They've discussed all manner of funding, and while this particular bill didn't go to a particular committee, it is, as you know, since I explained it, it covers the waterfront, and we have 5 appropriations committees. There wasn't one to which it particularly belonged, but all the appropriations committees have been busy at work.
So the answer is no. There was no appropriation committee that heard this amendment, correct?
But everything in this appropriation.
I'm not going to rely upon
has
you.
been
I'm not going to
considered
rely
by
upon you.
our
Our staff. One
committee.
substantive question about this staff, about this amendment. When our staff received this, 457, it's 500 pages. It's right there. From all respects, we believe it's approximately $7 billion of additional spending. The governor's office, GOMB, has not been able to completely read through this. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to rely upon you, nor should anybody in this chamber who has not had, at least on this side of the aisle, we've not had a chance to review it. And folks, we shouldn't take their representations of what this bill is, because we don't know what the heck's in it. All we know is a lot of spending. So what I want to do is go back in a time machine a little bit to 2010, which was probably one of the most despicable and embarrassing moments in congressional history, when at that time it was then Nancy Pelosi, who stated with regard to the ACA bill, "We have to pass the bill so you can find out what is in it." And that is what you are asking of us right now. We have been working diligently for the past 3 weeks to bring resolution to the budget impasse with our working groups on revenue, but also on reforms. I believe we're making progress. This is a slap in the face to the hard work of men and women who have been working on this, but also, more importantly, a slap in the face to every Illinoisan who wants honest government, who wants transparent government, who does not want to see a repeat of last year. And this is a repeat of last year on steroids. As an Illinoisan, as a taxpayer, and also a member of the legislature, I'm deeply embarrassed. And I guess I want to be angry, but this is an absolute joke. And I don't know, anybody could vote for this thing. Representative Skoog, do you think this is transparent? This year been down here for a few months. Is this really a good vote for you? Representative Clunan, likewise. Is this a good vote for transparency and for sound government? Folks, stop the madness. Let's get back to work instead of playing games. I was going to say this is a phony bill, but I don't know what is worse than phony. So anyway, I've had it. I'm not going to vote for this thing. No one in this building should vote. No one in this chamber should vote for this thing. This is a joke.
Chair recognizes Representative Sandek.
Thank you. Will the majority leader yield for some questions?
She indicates that she will yield.
So, Representative, I am certain because you're the sponsor of the amendment, you've read this bill, correct?
I have.
You've read all 500 pages.
Well, over the last couple of days, as we've worked on it, I've paid a lot of attention to the
So
detail.
let's look at page-
And the most important thing is that much of this measure is based, first of all, on other state funds as proposed by the governor in his budget for
Representative,
fiscal
this is
17,
your amendment.
and on monies that we appropriated this time last year. So
Okay,
there's
so-
not a lot that's new under this particular sun. I pointed to the education funding as something that is different, but much of it is numbers, material, programs that we've been looking at for well more than a year.
So your answer is, I want to make sure that please, just if you wouldn't mind, confine yourself to my question. You read the 500-page bill that you filed 2 hours ago?
I looked through the bill, I checked the numbers compared to last year's
Has any
plan.
member of your caucus read the bill that you're putting on the board right now in full?
I'm sure-
Has anyone read the full bill? The answer is no, and you know it. How much is the full spend
How
of
often-
your amendment, ma'am?
The total spending in other state funds as well as general funds is $47.8 billion.
How much is expected revenue?
GRF is 14.1.
How much is expected revenue in fiscal year 2017?
Well, as you know, Representative, we've had a lot of discussions, as had the governor, about
How about
the
just
need
answering the question?
for additional revenue in order to meet our responsibilities to needy, vulnerable populations. And I would certainly agree that I agree with the governor, I agree with others who pointed out
How
that we
much
need new
is the
revenue.
budget you propose out of balance, ma'am? I asked you what the revenue expectation is for fiscal year
Since I don't
2017.
I don't know what the dollars are that are going out
Give me
under
an approximation.
the many consent decrees that your governor has entered into. It's hard for me to get a handle on the total monies that will be available, total monies that are available.
Give me an expectation in your mind, an approximation, ma'am, of how much you think the state will receive in revenues in fiscal year 2017.
Well, if we do our work and if we decide that
God,
we're
can you
going
answer
to
a
be,
question, please?
the answer is, I can't tell because I don't know what's
Okay.
in the comptroller's
You don't know
office,
what your
what's out
budget
of the
bill expects
comptroller's
to
office.
spend. You don't know what your budget bill expects to bring in. Why are we doing this right now?
I told you why we're doing this right now, because we need an insurance policy for the
This is
people
an
of the
insurance
state of
policy?
Illinois who depend upon us, people who need a stable, solid budget. I am hopeful that there will be further discussions and compromises with the governor. As I said, I've been part of several of his working groups, but I don't think, since we never reached compromise a year ago, that we can count on that. I think it is critical for those whose programs have not been funded through consent decrees, for those whose programs have not been funded by continuing appropriations, that we give them the security of knowing that there is the possibility of a state budget in place in the coming fiscal year. It is shocking that there was not during the current fiscal year.
It is shocking because you didn't put one on the board. You haven't engaged in conversation. It's an outrage, actually.
We actually passed a budget. We sent a budget to the governor.
Okay.
Passed
To
a
the bill,
full budget.
excuse me,
He
to the
signed
amendment.
one portion of it, and since then, we've actually agreed with the governor on some 6 spending plans. Cooperation is possible, but it is not possible for us to walk away from this chamber without having offered some security to the people of the state of Illinois that there will be a budget, that we can govern the state, and that vulnerable populations will find that their needs can be met.
Thank you for the filibuster and the non-answers, Majority Leader. To the amendment, Mr. Speaker, I want to talk to my colleagues for a second, particularly those that I had the pleasure of working with and hope that I can continue to work with in the reform working groups that I've been involved in for the last week. I'm not sure there's anything more important what we're going to do, maybe today for sure. So I've worked with Democrats and Republicans in this chamber and in the Senate for about a week, maybe a week and a day. I think I've met 15 times with people on a variety of matters. Not one time was there anything not collegial. Not one time was there anything unprofessional. At all times, our discussions were substantive, thoughtful, and much gains had been made. Many gains. I'm not going to say full agreement because that wouldn't be correct. But on a couple of topics, we were darn close to finishing those matters and moving on to other things. In fact, I'm supposed to be in a meeting right now on workers' comp. We have made gains. Rank and file people who represent our constituents. This amendment is a joke. It is infuriating because we have a framework, a budget framework, and a reforms framework that can turn the state around and stop the hemorrhaging. But my goodness, if you're going to vote for this, you're putting $7.2 billion more of unfunded, unbalanced, illusory spending. This is a horrible message. Please search your consciousness, search your souls. This is exactly what we should not be doing. This is throwing cold water on progress. Don't take the bait. Don't be bullied or threatened. Vote no on this nonsense, and then let's continue to have thoughtful, engaging, collegial, professional, substantive budget and reform conversations. That's what we're elected to do. That's what all our constituents expect of us. This is absolutely an embarrassment. Don't do it. You're going to be held accountable for it. It is absolutely the wrong thing to do. Search your souls. Vote no.
Representative Dimmer is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the sponsor yield?
She indicates that she will.
Leader Curry, it's 6:58 p.m. right now. We had confirmation from the clerk that this amendment was released from the Rules Committee at 4:57 p.m., and it's 500 pages long. Do you believe it's reasonable that in the course of 2 hours, members on our side of the aisle would have the chance to review a 500-page amendment?
Yeah, I believe that your staff would have been very familiar with the budget that passed a year ago, and much of the spending in this bill
and how would we
reflects
know
those
that?
dollars. Your staff, I assume, has analyzed the governor's proposed spending for fiscal 17. Much of the money in other state funds comes directly from his proposals.
Oh, we've
There's
analyzed.
nothing new
We've
in
analyzed
this bill.
the other budgets.
There's
We've
nothing
analyzed the other
new
budgets.
that you haven't seen before.
500 pages. 500 pages in 2 hours. That doesn't seem fair. That doesn't seem reasonable. That doesn't seem possible
Your staff
to
knew
review
all these
500
numbers.
pages in 2 hours. Representative, when you mentioned earlier that programs that are covered by court orders or consent decrees are not included in this appropriation. Is that correct?
That is correct.
What is the total appropriation that you've offered in this amendment?
In general funds, it is $14.1 billion. COGFA anticipates that we will see about $33 billion in general funds during the coming fiscal year.
Excellent. So we'll have $33 billion.
In all funds, the total is 47.8.
Okay, so great. So we've got a revenue estimate, $33 billion in general revenue funds in 2017. You have
And this is
14
$14.1 billion in this bill.
$14 billion in this bill. All right, so that brings us down to $19 billion left. What is the estimated spend in FY17 for programs covered by court orders and consent decrees?
We don't know. We've tried to get that information. We
Does
don't
it
know
exceed
what's
$19 billion?
what's in the comptroller's office, and we're not privy. We were not part of any of those court-ordered consent decrees.
So you're comfortable appropriating
we're not
$14
sure.
billion
We do believe.
without knowing what we have?
As I said, we're not covering the consent decrees because those are already out there.
But those consent decrees and court orders require that we spend money out of the general revenue fund. Is that correct?
Under this budget bill, yes, we would spend money from general revenue, $14.1 billion.
And you give us a number of $33 billion.
Compared to $33 billion, which COP, I
$33
believe,
billion in income, $14 billion covered by this, yet no one can answer how much is covered by court orders and consent decrees. So you can't tell me if this is a balanced budget.
I can tell you that I told you from the beginning that I do believe, I agree with the governor, that we need additional revenues in the state in order to meet all of our obligations.
Where's that bill?
I'm waiting for the governor to offer it. It's part of his grand
Does the governor
bargain.
offer bills in the legislature?
The governor has
Don't
caused
representatives
to be
and senators
introduced-
offer bills in the legislature?
And don't we talk about the governor's introduced budget, even though the governor doesn't in fact introduce it?
Have you read any fiscal analysis of this bill that suggests that when you combine what's appropriated from general revenue funds in this bill, when you combine that with what's covered by court orders and consent decrees, what we're proposing tonight, for the first time in Illinois history, would spend more than $40 billion in a single fiscal year?
That's not my understanding from the limited analysis we have seen.
More than $40 billion. For the first time in Illinois history, more than $40 billion on what you have conceded is $33 billion in revenue. That's a $7 billion deficit. And just for those keeping score at home, the comptroller's website today reflects that there is $7.055 billion in unpaid bills. We will double the stack of unpaid bills by approving this bill tonight.
Right. But
We will
unfortunately,
double.
it was the governor that offered to enter into these consent decrees. The legislature was not part of it. I would also say that I don't know. We don't have actual spending levels from each of those consent decrees. Medicaid
A
bills are
majority of
paid,
these consent
but we
decrees
don't
were
know
entered
the size
into
of the
by the
Medicaid bills that will
Blagojevich and
come
Quinn
in.
administrations. And yet they still govern spending out of the general revenue fund today. So we must, as legislators, we must take into account the spending that's required out of the general revenue fund by court orders and consent decrees before we can consider what money remains for us to appropriate. We've heard tonight $33 billion is the revenue estimate for fiscal year 17, yet this bill, when taken in its entirety, would spend more than $40 billion out of the general revenue fund. Representative, I too was in the budget working groups. I sat with Republicans and Democrats from both the House and the Senate, and the discussions that we had in those groups never approached $40 billion in general revenue spending in a single fiscal year.
Well,
I can't imagine how anyone goes back to their districts and can sell to voters the idea that we would spend $7 billion more than what we're taking in. I can't imagine how you sell that. I can't imagine how after year of unbalanced budgets that have led us to a point where vendors are waiting hundreds of days to get payment out of the general revenue fund. I can't imagine how we vote on a bill like this tonight. Vote no, ladies and gentlemen. Vote no until you've had a chance to read 500 pages of appropriations bills. We can't pass this bill to find out what's in it. We have to know what's in it before we vote on the bill. Vote no.
And I would just say that I do not
Mr.
accept...
Speaker, I'd like to request a verification should this bill receive the requisite number of votes.
I do not accept the $40 billion that the prior speaker bandied about. That was certainly not a number that the director of the governor's Office of Management and Budget ever came close to in our discussions in the budget working group.
Representative Demmer has requested a verification. Chair recognizes Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House. I wanted to just kind of address some of the previous speakers with regard to the working groups. Now, we have been working for the last week and a half. To my mind, we should have started sooner. I wish we would have started sooner. I think everybody on that side of the aisle would have agreed. However, what we're here to discuss today is making sure that we don't shirk our responsibilities as legislators in case we're not successful. That's what this is all about. Have the working groups been cordial? Yes. Have we worked in good faith? I would say yes, we have. Have we come to a conclusion in all these working groups? We haven't. We haven't. We have a few days left, and I'm committed to continue to work with the working groups to try and discuss on issues with regard to workers' compensation, issues with regard to trying to find some reasonable ground on ancillary issues with regard to collective bargaining. But can I tell you, these are difficult issues. We're not pulling the plug. We're not saying we're not going to keep working together. We're saying if we don't move the ball forward and for some reason we fail in the working group process, we want to have a spending plan in place. Period. End of discussion, exclamation point. That's what this bill would do. I know you don't agree with it, but why do we want to take ourselves to the 11th hour where Rome is burning and we're not going to know what we're going to do next because our school districts, our universities, our public institutions, our social service agencies don't have a spending plan? I'm not willing to do that. I'm going right back upstairs in room 400 where we have business and labor, the governor's office, your caucus, our caucus, Senate Dems, Senate Republicans, and I'm going to continue to work through the night, like we did last night, on trying to find a solution on the issue of workers' compensation reform. But it is difficult. It is difficult. And as we face these difficult issues, we're going to continue to be committed to working with you, with the governor's office, with the Senate Dems, with the Senate Republicans, to reach consensus that can move us forward. But we're not going to stand by and let Rome burn and let the state of Illinois' budget and no spending plan be put forward. That's what this does. That's why I'm voting aye, and that's why I ask you to vote aye as well.
Chair recognizes Representative Bill Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, Madam Leader, I've got a question. Hello, there's someone in the way. Can you move out? The guy right there, move. I can't see the leader.
Hey, Jay, thanks. Thanks.
Okay. I will. Thank you. Thank you. Madam Leader, I think you have a difficult job today. You've got to sell something that's really unsaleable. But nonetheless, I have to have a question. How much money did the state of Illinois have in the bank this morning?
I don't have that information. You might want to call the comptroller.
I know, it's online. It's online. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, it's $182 million. Okay, we have $182 million in our bank account, and we had $7.1 billion of unpaid bills. We had 36,000 vendors owed money, and yet you want to spend $40,455 million. Is that correct, Madam Leader? Does that sound good?
No,
sound okay?
It doesn't sound right at all.
Well, these are facts. These are facts. You know, everyone has an opinion, but these are facts.
Well, except that the facts that the director of the Governor's Office of Management and Budget does not match the figures you are reporting on the House floor.
Then under this budget, what would be the deficit?
As I say, I don't have access to all those numbers, but the numbers that we've heard do not reach anything like the amount you're describing.
You're proposing something, and you tell the people of Illinois, we don't know how much it's going to cost?
What I said is that we don't know what the actual cost of those decrees that the governor entered into, that the governor said yes to, ultimately will cost. It depends on what services, for example, the Medicaid providers offer. We don't just say, okay, everybody gets a check for $100. You only get reimbursed for the services you provide our clients, as an example.
Madam Leader, I think the director of GOMB was in your group and said this is the numbers, 40 billion, 455
He
million.
did not, I'm sorry, he did not say that.
What did he say?
You know, I think he didn't discuss that specifically. He did talk about owing monies beyond what we anticipate or COGPA anticipates will come in next year, but it wasn't to the tune of $8 billion or $7 billion.
One thing I think everyone in this chamber would agree, this is not a balanced budget. Is that correct? Will expenditures...
We're appropriating $14.1 billion out of general revenue. We're told that by COGPA that we'll have $33 billion in general revenue funds in the coming fiscal year.
You're very creative. I'll give you that. Good A for that. Madam Leader, and you've been here for a while, and so have I, and I appreciate the job you've done. But one thing that is our obligation, every 2 years we raise our hands and we take an oath to the Constitution of the United States and the state of Illinois. And one of it says, in our Constitution, the state of Illinois says, we have to pass a balanced budget. This is not a balanced budget. Everyone knows that. We all know that. Let's stop the charade. We know we're spending more money into this budget than the revenue. Now, you have, the voters of the state of Illinois, in their infinite wisdom, have given the Democratic Party 71 votes. You've got 71 votes in this chamber. It takes 60 votes to pass anything. If you want to spend $40 billion and some change, then you can do that, and you can pass the revenues. What I'm saying, there is a difference in political parties. You are certainly more aggressive in saying there's a problem, you want a government program. I differ with that, okay? We have an honest difference of opinion. Governing is about making choices. This budget isn't making choices. This budget is saying we're going to be Santa Claus in May. And the people of Illinois are smart enough to know Santa Claus is in December, okay? This is a fraud. The people of Illinois are just sick and tired of fraudulent budgets, one after another. I urge the vote no. Thank you.
Representative Ives is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to the bill. Most children are very fond of fairy tales. Maybe they, sit up on the bed at night and they've read the Brothers Grimm, who first published in 1812 a collection of stories known as the Grimm's Fairy Tales. Most of those stories began with Once Upon a Time, and they usually ended with Happily Ever After. But we don't have a fair maiden that can spin straw into gold here in Illinois. And in 2016, what we have in this bill is Speaker Madigan's fairy tale, except that it doesn't end happily ever after. It ends as a horror movie for taxpayers. Taxpayers are going to be destroyed by this bill. How many more episodes or how many more tales are we going to have of unbalanced budget? The last time we had a balanced budget was in 2001. There's no way to pay for this spending plan without a massive tax increase that Illinois has never seen. And unfortunately, this state has done nothing to reform its spending, to reform the way we do business. We have not earned the right to new revenue. This is all a fairy tale. It's one big bedtime story. We need to put it to rest and start back again with a new title.
Leader Lang is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. I've heard a lot of interesting rhetoric on the other side of the aisle. Some of the most amusing and laughable were people complaining about only 2 hours to read this bill. You only had 2 hours to read the bill, I'll give you that. However, don't make it seem as if you had 500 hours to read the bill or 5,000 hours to read the bill. You'd be voting any differently when we vote on the bill. So you can say all of those things, but you're going to be no or present or whatever other button you can make up that isn't yes when we go to vote on the bill. Somebody said over there, well, you know, the governor doesn't introduce bills. Well, okay, but you know, every time we tried to do something on workers' comp or property tax relief or any of those things, you guys over there are always saying, well, this isn't the governor's language. Well, if the governor doesn't have bills, what do you mean when you say it's not the governor's language? So you should pick one position and stick with it. I think there's some value in sticking to a position. I think there's some value in not just making up things to say when you've spent the last year saying other things. Just stick to your position, find some way to rationalize it, or if you feel deeply that what you're saying is correct, then stick to it. You don't have to make up things on the House floor to make your position sound good. Just say what you think. That's what this place is for. I found it interesting that many on that side of the aisle either completely ignored the consent decrees, the reason that we're so far in the hole now, or mentioned the consent decrees but just simply accepted them and then said that the proposal we make today blows a hole through the ceiling of whatever money we have. I didn't see the governor or any of the governor's lawyers or any of the governor's staff or anybody representing the governor go into any one of these courtrooms that have issued consent decrees and say, we don't want these consent decrees anymore, we can't afford them. In fact, the governor has simply allowed these consent decrees to blow a hole through all the money we have. As we know, 90 or 92 or whatever % of the money we have to spend is gone through these, and these courts have ordered us to pay not based on current revenue, but based on revenue we don't even have. They've required us to pay based on fiscal 15 numbers where we had a 5% income tax that we no longer have, and yet, instead of going into a courtroom with his battery of lawyers to say, Your Honors, we can't do this anymore. We want to make a motion to vacate these consent decrees because the state of Illinois can't afford to pay these dollars. Instead of doing that, he just sits on the sideline and allows us to overspend and overspend and overspend, not because of a budget, but because the courts have ordered us to spend money we don't have. And yet, not a single effort by this governor or this administration to file a single motion in a single courtroom before a single judge saying, we give, Your Honor, we can't do this anymore. But the other side of the aisle, my good friends over there, have decided that we're going to accept that overspending because the governor thinks that's okay. We're going to accept that billions of dollars of overspending ordered by courts under consent decrees. Consent means we agreed to pay that money. And if we're not going to agree to pay that money anymore, the chief executive of the state of Illinois needs only to send his lawyers into those courtrooms and argue that we never should have made those agreements in the first place. But I don't see that happening. Instead, we simply accept those numbers and rail against these numbers. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you can argue that these numbers blow a hole in the ceiling of the revenue we have if you want, and maybe does, but only because those other payments from those consent decrees are still out there. If you want to be real about this, you have to accept the fact that those consent decrees are costing us some of this deficit we have, some of this debt we have. The ballooning problem we have is as a result of A, not enough revenue, and B, consent decrees. And you can say we're overspending, but you better include, when you're talking about overspending, the lack of action by the second floor of this building regarding these consent decrees. Because if you ignore that, you're just simply accepting the political reality that I guess you all accept, that, well, the governor doesn't want to do anything about the consent decrees, and therefore we'll just rail on the other stuff. Get real, include all of it. If you're going to try to be fair, then it seems to me you have to include all of it, not just the parts that are convenient for you. Finally, we wouldn't be where we are today if the governor of the state of Illinois hadn't decided to put his personal political agenda ahead of the people of the state of Illinois. It's just that simple. You and I all know we'd have had a budget a year ago if the governor didn't order all of you to stand down and get away from the budget while he tries to manipulate the General Assembly and the people of the state of Illinois into believing that the turnaround agenda is as important as feeding a child, as taking care of a sick person, as dealing with those with mental illness, as dealing with those with epilepsy, paying for MAP grants, paying for higher education. Now, if you don't want to include that in the discussion, then you're being disingenuous. No one on this side of the aisle said that we have all the money to pay for what's in Senate Bill 2048. In fact, we have said, as we said last year, we believe that we need a budget that relies on cuts and a budget that relies on new revenue, just as your beloved governor has said. Just as the governor has said, we need cuts and we need new revenue. Now, if you don't want to be disingenuous about it, you have to accept the fact that that's what the governor of the state of Illinois said. And so, my friends, let's have a real debate on the floor if you want to have one, but let's include all the facts. You can say whatever you want about Senate Bill 2048, and you will, and you'll say it whether you had 5 minutes, 5 hours, or 5 years to read it. Your votes are all going to be the same. Just as they were on the education budget last year that you all voted no on, that the governor signed declaring it his greatest achievement in his first year in office. So let's be real. Let's talk about all the facts, not just the convenient political ones. I would recommend an aye vote.
Chair recognizes Representative Rita.
Mr. Speaker, I move to the previous question.
Gentleman moves the previous question, and the previous question is put. The question is, shall Senate Bill 2048 pass? All in favor, vote aye. All opposed, vote nay. The voting is open. Have all voted to wish? Have all voted to wish? Have all voted to wish? Ms. Clerk, please take the record. On the count of 63 voting yes, 53 voting no, and 1 voted present, Senate Bill 2048, having received a constitutional majority, is hereby declared passed. And now, allowing perfunctory time for the clerk, the House adjourns until Thursday. Leader Curry moves that the House adjourns until Thursday, May 25th at the hour of 1 p.m.